There is a scar scientists expected to find in human DNA. It is not there. Not the way the textbooks describe it. Not in the shape a catastrophe should leave. That was the problem. 1 million people died in a single decade. 1 million more vanished across an ocean, never to return home. The numbers are not in dispute, but when geneticists went looking for the wound that kind of death toll should leave behind, in Ireland in the 1840s, they found something stranger than a bottleneck. Something did survive in the DNA, just not what anyone expected to find. Look at the numbers first, because the numbers are not the mystery. In 1841, Ireland counted just over 8 million people. 10 years later, the census recorded 6.5 million. That is not a slow decline. That is a fifth of a population gone in a single decade through starvation, disease, and departure. A blight took the potato. The potato was almost everything for the rural poor, and nowhere more than in the West. In Connaught and Munster, where whole parishes still spoke Irish as a first language and owned almost nothing but a plot of ground and a crop that failed. What followed was mass death, and one of the largest single exoduses in human history, over 2 million people leaving in barely a decade, scattering into ships bound for Liverpool, Boston, Quebec, New York. So when someone says a catastrophe like that should leave a mark in the DNA of the people descended from it, that is not a wild claim. That is basic population genetics. A population that loses a fifth of itself that fast should show it, generations later, in the shape of shared DNA segments passed down through survivors. Geneticists have a name for that shape. They call it a bottleneck, a narrowing, a genetic choke point you can still trace centuries on. So they went looking for it in Ireland. And here is where the story stops being simple. The tools used to find a bottleneck work by tracing shared fragments of DNA called identity by descent segments across modern people. In plain terms, that means finding pieces of genetic code that two people both inherited from the same shared ancestor and using how long and how common those shared pieces are to work backward, generation by generation, toward how big or small a population used to be. Run that analysis on Ireland, and the signal you would expect around the 1840s is not clearly there. Recent research modeling population history across Ireland and Britain found sharp, recent bottlenecks. All right, but not centered where the textbook story says they should be. They showed up in Orkney, in the Isle of Man, in parts of Wales, not in Ireland, where the deaths were highest and the exodus was largest. That is not a small detail. That is the whole mystery sitting right there in the data. The easy explanation collapses fast once you look closer. Maybe you might think Ireland was already a distinct, tightly bound population, and the famine just deepened something that was already there. And there is some truth in that. Modern Irish genomes really do carry unusually high levels of what geneticists call homozygosity, long identical stretches inherited from both parents, more than you see in neighboring Britain. For a while, that looked like exactly the fingerprint the famine should leave. But when researchers traced how old that pattern actually is, it did not line up with the 1840s. It pointed centuries earlier toward old Gaelic dynastic structures and inheritance patterns that shaped who married whom long before the blight ever touched a single field. The distinctiveness was already old. The famine did not create it. It just happened to survivors of a story that was already written into the genome long before anyone had ever heard of potato blight. Here's a second myth, and it breaks even faster. Ireland carries the highest known frequency in the world of a genetic variant linked to hereditary hemochromatosis, an iron overload condition sometimes nicknamed the Celtic curse. It is tempting, almost irresistible, to read that as a survival trait. A body that hoards iron more efficiently, the story goes, would have had an edge during famine. Neat. Satisfying. Wrong. or at least not proven. The variant behind that condition is estimated to be roughly 4,000 years old, tracing back to the Neolithic or Bronze Age, long before the famine, long before colonization, long before any of it. Ireland's DNA carries a real signature of scarcity and hardship. It is just an older one, layered underneath a newer catastrophe that, on paper, looks strangely quiet. So if the population signal is not where it should be, and the disease myth does not hold, what is actually left? Maybe the wrong question was being asked from the start. Maybe the famine did not leave its mark as a population signal at all. Maybe it left its mark as a selection signal, something that operates on individual bodies, not on the shape of a whole gene pool. That is a very different kind of scar, and it is much harder to see because of how it works. Picture a townland in County Mayo or County Clare, the winter of 1847, what survivors would later call Black 47. Not a documented family, not a name from a record, but a household like thousands that existed across the west of Ireland that year. A one-room cabin, a field of blackened stalks where food should have been. This is not a reconstruction of a real recorded scene, it is a way to understand a mechanism that demographers have since measured. In a household like this, it was rarely the strongest adult who died first. It was the infant, the already sick, the elderly, the already weakened. Famine does not kill evenly, it kills selectively, and it kills the most vulnerable first, over and over, across thousands of households, until an entire region's population is not just smaller, it is different, filtered, reshaped by exactly who did not make it to spring, and by exactly who did. Now bring the data back in, because this is where the story turns. A recent study in economic history examined more than 14,000 birth and height records from across famine-era Ireland. Comparing regions, the blight hit hardest against regions it barely touched. If the old story were the whole story, the worst hit regions should show the clearest signs of biological damage, stunted growth, smaller bodies, the physical scars of starvation carried into the generation that survived it. That is not what the records show. In the regions with the highest death tolls, in Connaught, in West Munster, in Mayo, Clare, Galway, Kerry, the surviving population shows no measurable stunting at all. The damage is not there. Meanwhile, in regions where the famine's grip was comparatively lighter, stunting does appear. Sit with that for a second because it inverts everything you would expect. It is not that the worst hit places suffered less. It is that the worst hit places suffered so completely and so selectively that the people it should have visibly damaged did not live long enough to be measured at all. The absence of a scar is not evidence of a gentler famine. It is evidence of the harshest one, a famine so severe that it erased the very people who would have carried proof of it. What looks like recovery in the data is not recovery. It is a filter so brutal, it removed its own fingerprints. This is the twist underneath the twist. The scar was never missing. It just does not look like a scar. It looks like an absence. And an absence, read correctly, can be the loudest evidence of all. That reframes the deeper genetic map, too. Fine-scale studies of Irish DNA have found real tight regional clustering that still tracks the Western landscape. More distinct genetic structure, surviving in the west of Ireland, less in the east, where centuries of movement wore older boundaries smooth. For a long time, that Western structure was easy to explain as isolation, distance from ports, distance from cities, distance from change. But isolation explains preservation. It does not explain how that structure held its shape through the very decade that should have scattered it completely. What held there was not simply distance. It was structure old enough and deep enough that even a selection event this brutal could not fully erase it. The land did not just witness the famine. In a strange way, its oldest genetic architecture outlasted it. The clearest map the famine era actually left behind is not written inside Ireland at all. It is written into the people who left. Genetic research on descendant communities in places like Newfoundland has traced founder populations directly back to specific Irish counties: Waterford, Wexford, South Kilkenny, Southeast Tipperary, Southeast Cork, quarters of departure preserved almost like a signature in the DNA of people who never set foot on the island their ancestors fled. That corridor is mostly older than the worst famine years, rooted in immigration that had already begun before the Blight. But it proves the method works. It proves a population's departure route can survive, generation after generation, inside descendants who have never seen the coastline their families left behind. The famine's genetic map was never going to be a wound sitting quietly inside Ireland. It was always going to be a route drawn across an ocean in the bodies of the people who ran. None of this makes DNA the whole story, and it was never supposed to be. A biological signal can point toward a corridor, a filter, a pattern. It cannot carry the loss of a language spoken in a home that emptied out. It cannot carry a name passed down through 3 generations of exile. It cannot carry what a community remembers about a winter that ended entire villages. The genetics complicates the old explanation. It does not replace the human one. It sharpens memory. It does not substitute for it. So the scar scientists went looking for was never missing. It was just never going to look the way anyone expected. Not a clean break in a population graph. Not a disease born from hardship. Something quieter and heavier, hiding inside an absence instead of a presence. A silence so complete, it could only have been made by something that took everyone capable of proving it happened. If a catastrophe this well documented can still hide its own evidence in plain sight, in birth records and genetic maps, in the shape of who simply was not there to be measured, it raises a harder question than the one this story opened with. How many other famines and other silences are still sitting in the archive, mistaken for something gentler than what they actually were, waiting for someone to notice that the quiet was never innocent?